and thank you for tuning in this week. I'm Adriana, the host of Cultivate the Moments, and today I had the opportunity to chat with Allegra from Kindred Roots Counselling. She's a social worker by profession and really allowed us to have a interdisciplinary conversation and take into account ourselves and our clients in more of a holistic manner. So to preface, she starts the conversation sharing her personal journey, shares what meaningful recreation and leisure looks like to her, and then she dives in and explains what social workers do. And in this conversation, we talked about those crossovers between the importance of recreation and leisure and how they really can recharge our wellness tanks and how vital self-care is in our lives. We go deep into this conversation, and I can't wait for you to tune in. Hello. It's so nice to have you. So today I am sharing my platform and space with Allegra from Kindred Roots Counselling. And so I would love to just start off by getting you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hey, thanks for having me. I'm Allegra. I'm a social worker by trade. I have a master's of social work with a clinical specialization. I am in Calgary, Alberta. I've worked throughout the whole healthcare system. Currently, I work in what's called primary care networks here in Alberta. So I support doctors' offices in central Alberta in kind of addressing social needs of their patients to prevent them from accessing things like hospital care. So I see all types of people from different communities. But previous to that, I've worked in hospital, I've worked in long-term care, supported living, hospice, home care, pretty much the whole spectrum you could imagine. And then on top of my current role with the primary care network, I own Kindred Roots Counselling. So I do quite a bit of counseling with people throughout the lifespan for various reasons. A lot of the work I've done in the last couple of years has been very much focused on life fulfillment and how we find, joy and engagement in day-to-day life, or feeling kind of stuck and wondering what direction we should go. And a big thing that I like to push, talk about, use my platform for is the idea of self-care, understanding what fills your cup, and just making yourself feel like the best version you can possible. So that's like a very quick synopsis of me.
That is really awesome. I have a few follow-up questions. So I'm really wondering, what started this passion in social work and how has it evolved?
Yeah, so I knew I wanted to work with people since I was a child. I just didn't know in what capacity. And then this might sound a bit interesting. I was lucky enough to be a caregiver to my grandmother when I was just a teenager. And I went through the continuing care process with her, from home care right through to, long-term care inevitably until she passed. And I, worked with social workers in that process. I had a idea of like how I would have handled things from a social work perspective. I was inspired by some great social workers. And from that, I was like, I want to get in there. I want to, I had this idea, I think a lot of social workers do, of like, I'm going to change the system. And you kind of realize in practice, it's not as easy as it sounds, but I really wanted to make sure that anyone I worked with had a positive experience to try and alleviate, the stress that I experienced myself in accessing social work. And so, yeah, and then every time a door opened, I just said yes, and it's kind of just led me to the path of where I'm at now.
That's really awesome. Yeah, I read your story, and for those who are interested in reading more of your story, I saw it on your website, and it was really just inspiring. I think a lot of us in helping professions just like naturally know that we're helpers, and through personal life experience and finding our way through that. Lots of the time, it shapes us into better helping professionals. So that's really awesome, and I appreciate you sharing your story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with you. I think that people that work in helping professions, it's a job of passion. And so I don't think you could ask a single person who works in a helping profession what brought them here without there being some sort of personal experience. I think we all sign up for this line of work because we've been drawn to it from something that happened in our personal lives. And I love it. I think it's what makes us unique to a lot of other, professional bodies.
I completely agree for sure. And so when you were introducing yourself, you kind of mentioned how you really love talking about and helping with life fulfillment and self care, and inevitably finding out what fills your bucket. So I'm wondering if recreation and leisure for your clients or for yourself plays a role in this.
Massively, without a doubt. I think that there is really no such thing as a lifestyle that feels fulfilling that doesn't include some, element of recreation or leisure. I think it looks completely different for each person. And it takes being a little bit introspective to understand what actually makes you feel good versus what you're doing out of quote unquote obligation. In my personal life, I have been your typical kind of yo-yo, diet or workout or whatever you want to call it. I've realized as an adult that I need physical activity on a day to day basis to not kind of get wrapped up in my head. Um, you know, as a social worker and a therapist, I talk all day long, and sometimes removing myself from talking to moving is the only way that I shut that off. So, in my personal life, leisure and recreation are the things that keep me sane. For some people, it doesn't necessarily have to be anything physical or movement based, but it has to be something that you do for no other purpose but making yourself feel good or making you happy. We are a generation of people who have been kind of coached to believe that you have to do everything with purpose, and sometimes that purpose is solely driven by like income, education, expanding your resume, and we forget that you can live a life with purpose where the only purpose is just joy and happiness. So trying to like reroute the way that people look at meaningful activities is it's so important for being in a sustainable headspace, or a headspace that keeps you feeling like you're living life the way you want to be living it versus how you think you should be living it.
Yeah, for sure. I love how you really shaped in there, the societal like stigma or standard that, we previously had and we're slowly working out for some of us, but it's definitely really challenging at times for sure.
100%. And I think it's so easy to see it or say it on paper, but to actually put it into action is like it feels next to impossible. I kind of describe it like, in life there's like a switch, and we might know that we should flick that switch on, but we're not ready to. But when you eventually feel that urge to flick it and the light goes on, everything feels tenfold easier. So I feel like the more we have these conversations and normalize that it's okay to change maybe the way you look at certain things, the more likely people are to flip their switch and see things through like a more healthy and sustainable lens. So honestly, I think the more we have conversations like this, the better it is, long term for the majority of people.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, a really big thing is that there's a ripple effect to the activities that we do. So if it feels like, oh, we're just doing this for enjoyment and fulfillment, well, there's a ripple effect of recharging us at the end of a long day or a long week that really influences everything, and you have enjoyment in that moment too, for sure.
Totally. It's a cyclical process, right? Like I don't know a single person who says that they feel inspired or motivated out of exhaustion and stress. And so, we kind of have to think about what led us to make the decisions we've made. Was it at a time where you felt like you were completely drained and at your lowest? Or is it generally, you've come back from vacation, you've had a great weekend with friends, like, and you suddenly feel this urge to, you know, promote maybe the betterment of yourself, and that could be things like your professional life, the way that you're working out or how much effort you're putting into volunteer activities. But we generally don't try and be our best selves when we're feeling like we're running on empty. So I completely agree, they all work hand in hand. We are just more apt to put the things we quote unquote have to do first and forget that the things that we quote unquote choose to do aren't just equally as important.
Yeah, for sure. I always recommend people like in their day-to-day schedule have a mix of recreation and leisure in there as well. That's really
Yeah,
important.
100%. Me
Yeah,
too.
awesome. So speaking about recreation and leisure, I'd love to know from you, what does meaningful recreation and leisure look like to you?
So to me, I think that, with my life experience and the things that I've done and the people I've worked with, what it means to me is that recreation and leisure are things or time that we dedicate to giving ourselves energy to recognize that we have choice and giving ourselves the perspective that every decision that we make is a decision of our own. And so that can sound very like broad, but I think if we really dig through it, recreation and leisure are the things that we choose to do with our time for the sole purpose of happiness, joy, and fulfillment. There's no other obligation assigned to it but that. Um, it's something that we all know we should be doing. It's something that very few of us do. One of the first questions I ask all of my clients when they hire me as a therapist is, what do you do every week that is just for yourself? And I think I've had one client out of all of the clients I've ever had that actually had an answer at the first session. And I think that speaks to just the lack of emphasis that we put on recreation and leisure and the lack of acknowledgement of its importance in people's lives. And so, yeah, to me, it's just about choosing yourself and then choosing to make that a sustainable habit in your life.
Yeah, that's awesome. And uh, it's I find it really interesting as well how many people, prioritize everything else and kind of leave recreation and leisure out of that. But really taking a step back, I'd love for you to explain, what social work is and what social workers do, because I think they're very vital in the care team and
Yeah.
in society as well.
Yeah, so social work it's a huge area of work. You could pretty much pick any sector of social supports, and there's likely a social worker working in some capacity. So it's hard to define. Social work is built on a principle that people struggle in life not always based on what's going on internally, but based on external factors around them as well. And so we could be looking at things like, yeah, general societal culture and the way that we are trained to look at things. It could be based on, socioeconomic status. It could be based on race, ethnicity, family background, stress management, mental health. It's kind of an understanding that nothing in life happens without a lot of factors or external pressures. I think, in my area of social work, which is often very comparative to psychology, psychology tends to look at what's going on within the person and how we treat that person so that they can handle the external world. Social work looks at how what's going on with the external person is caused by their external environment and how we work on fixing both so that the person can live a sustainable lifestyle while also understanding the circumstances that they're choosing to put themselves into. So we all work very much, hand in hand with each other. I know that you also understand like interdisciplinary teamwork. Social work, I kind of say, is like the glue that puts everyone together. So when there's like that, but what do we do with X? Generally, X ends up on social work's plate. So sometimes I call us just professional Google users. It totally depends on the case, but no 2 days look the same, and that's the best part.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think something really interesting is I imagine that the social model of disability and like just social models in general play so uh, in depthly in social work. And it's so interesting. And I think, as a rec therapist and as other rec therapists and other people listening, really moving forward, taking that recognition that, there's so many things contributing to our wellness that are outside of us that we can't necessarily control all the time. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Totally. And I think that, like, for rec therapists out there, like you said, people listening, it's an understanding that sometimes the problem that you think you're fixing isn't actually the problem itself. And you kind of have to learn to see, like, one of my sayings I say all the time is like, see the forest through the trees. So you have to like take a step back and go, okay, maybe my client isn't progressing the way I expected them to, but is it because the style of work I'm doing isn't working, or is it something happening completely outside of what I've been looking at that's having a substantial influence on how they're actually functioning. And so, yeah, it's about just looking at the bigger picture and recognizing that there is a lot of factors that come into play when we're sorting out what people are struggling with.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think that's so vital in, all of our interactions, whether it be professionally or just personally. Looking at it and taking a step back and really empathizing with not only that current present experience, but stepping back and saying there's a larger picture to this is so big.
Yeah, 100%. I think that we see this even like in day-to-day life now with I think a big thing's like social media, and we make a lot of assumptions about people based on what we see online and trying not to jump to conclusions. We see this just in people we see out at restaurants or at coffee shops, and we're like, whoa, why are you acting this way? And we have to just remember, like, there's a lot happening behind closed doors that we aren't privy to. And so just trying to give everyone the benefit of the doubt and recognize that we can't necessarily judge a book by its cover, and that if you really want to make an informed decision, you have to read the whole book first.
Yes, yes, I love that analogy. That's so true for sure.
Hmm.
So we talked a little bit about um, fulfillment and our what I like to call like our wellness tank. So I'm wondering, what as professionals and people listening, how can we fill up our wellness tank? What kind of activities would you recommend, typically to your client? I know this is very individualized,
Hmm.
so this is going to be a hard question, and I'm happy to help too.
Yeah. So, and that's, I mean, definitely the biggest part of it is that everyone's going to need something a little bit different. I think the number one thing is you have to ask yourself, what activities do you do that actually make you feel like you are rejuvenated and have more energy versus things that you think you should be doing that aren't necessarily working for you. So I'll give you an example. Um, Oftentimes, when we talk about self care, most people's minds go to things like meditation, yoga, healthy eating, walking. These are very much like the stereotypical things that we would assign to self care. This doesn't necessarily work for everybody. So, myself, I have no problem saying some self care for me is having a day where I dedicate doing nothing but watching Netflix and eating popcorn on my couch. It's okay to own that the quote unquote self care day you're taking isn't necessarily aligned with a healthy lifestyle choice. I think that you have to kind of separate the two.
Mhm.
And I often find that when you're trying to decide what self care looks like for you, it's about looking at what completely opposes what drains your tank. So, for someone in a helping profession, you spend a lot of time around people. You're often owning a lot of people's problems as your own. You can often feel a lot of compassion fatigue, and just general exhaustion. So, your self care probably shouldn't be about listening to people's problems, getting to know new people, because it's going to feel very much like your day-to-day work. So often for helping professionals, it's things like time alone, silence, music. It might be exercise because you're, generally not doing much physical activity, but it's something that directly opposes what your day-to-day life looks like. This could be totally different for someone that works an office job and is, typing in numbers all day. Maybe their self-care is about social engagement and talking to new people and visiting with family or whatever. I think there's also a need to recognize that we have to schedule self-care with the same level of uh, commitment that we do with other things. And sometimes time off work is perceived to be self-care time. But for those of us that are, blessed with big families or groups of friends, you might get Saturday and Sunday off and have a family dinner one day and a friend engagement the next day and not feel like you got any you time. So you have to pay deep attention to, am I actually making myself feel refilled, or am I doing things that I think should make me feel refilled, but I'm going back to work Monday feeling absolutely exhausted?
Yeah, yeah, I echo all of that, and I think a really big question to ask yourself is like, what activities are you doing? Are they meaningful or are they, maybe maladaptive for myself. I know like scrolling on my phone can become very maladaptive very quickly.
Oh yeah.
That's just a personal thing. But I know it affects lots of us. So kind of prioritizing, self-care and wellness and leisure and recreation and saying, instead of spending 2 hours scrolling on my phone, I'm going to spend, an hour reading, 30 minutes walking, um, and 30 minutes on the phone.
100%. And writing that down, I don't know how most people keep their calendars. I'm kind of old fashioned. I literally use pen and paper still. It's the only way I keep myself organized. I will literally write down when I have booked time for myself. So, maybe it's like I'm going to go to the gym on my lunch hour. I have a habit of working through my lunch hour. So when I write it on my calendar, I will not double book myself. I see it as a double booking, not as something that I can easily just block out and put something else in. If you schedule things on a calendar on your phone, like actually inserting a committed time to yourself, I think makes a tenfold difference. And it's something that feels very foreign to us. But again, it goes back to like, you have to commit that what you do for yourself is equally as important to all of your other commitments that you have on your plate.
Yes, yes, for sure. And I think it was really interesting how you talked about, your profession and what fills you up and what things you do, for the entire day. For both of us, I think we talk to people a lot. And so definitely for me, maybe it's listening to someone else talk through a podcast or maybe it's listening to music. But I think um, taking that time to understand what things may be draining you throughout the day that are just natural things that are happening and what things can maybe counterbalance that is really big.
Totally. And I think that sometimes there's a perception that, like, how do I say this? Like, if you feel like aspects of your job are draining you, then you must hate your job. And that's not at all the case. You just can't do one thing all of the time without it eventually burning you out. And so, I love talking to people. I love meeting new people. I love my clients. But everyone knows that you can't talk all of the time without eventually feeling exhausted. And so it doesn't like admitting that you need a break from what your job asks you to do doesn't mean that you hate your job. It just means that you recognize that you are then needing to bring balance back to counteract what you are doing more of than you would if you weren't working, a regular, 9 to 5 or 8 to 4, or whatever it is that you're spending most of your days doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point because same thing with recreation therapy, even, working as a recreation therapy assistant the last year, I already burnt out and had a lot of compassion fatigue and got into a spout of depression. And with that, I still love recreation therapy so much, but I realized that I wasn't doing recreation therapy. I wasn't doing activities for myself.
Mhm.
And so really recognizing, take a step back and writing out what are those things. I'm definitely a writer. Some people are not, but I need to write out and really make my thoughts concrete. And sometimes I'm not at that level to do that. Sometimes I'm not ready to commit to that written out thing because it feels so much more real. But definitely doing what's right for you, but taking that introspective look is so huge for sure.
100%, 100%. And I think, again, it looks different for everyone. So you really have to pay attention to like how you're feeling, how certain activities make you feel, and not try to deny whatever's coming up for you, because denying it and burying it is not going to make it go away. So you just have to always be a little bit more alert than we've been trained to about not just what's on your calendar, but how you're actually feeling about what's on your calendar.
Yeah. Just brainstorming with you, I know we've had a few different things come up for like questions to ask ourselves. So one was like, how do we prioritize our time? What activities are we doing now? And what things are, positive and what things may be draining? Do you have any other things that maybe some introspective questions that we can ask ourselves when determining what things we might want to do and look at in the future, so that we can, have that balance or a little bit more balance?
Yeah, I'd say paying attention to your internal dialogue is massive. So sometimes, like, again, if you're someone that like puts things in a calendar, when you're writing that down, what is going through your head? Are you like, okay, I'll get that done, or okay, this will check something off my list, or I haven't done this in a while, I should do it, or is it like, I'm so excited for this coming up, or I can't wait for this day to get there, because what your internal dialogue is telling you is often going to be a direct indication of if you're getting what you need from that activity. You can't filter your internal voice, so listen to it. It's generally telling you something that you need to be hearing. The other thing I would say is when you go to bed at night and you're kind of laying there reflecting on your day, what parts of your day were you super happy about versus what parts of your day are you trying to just kind of like put to rest? Generally, the things we're trying to put to rest are things that we shouldn't be doing repetitively. But if there's something that you go to bed at night and you're like, that was so awesome, or like, I'm so proud of myself, or like, I should do that more often, again, your internal voice is telling you something that you should consider when you wake up the next day and are trying to choose how you're going to spend your time.
Yeah, that's some really great questions, and I will be sure to, make a list of them so that we can all, utilize them and share them to reflect on ourselves afterwards. Um, I think something interesting that kind of came up for me when we were talking about that was really, that anxiousness that I get when I'm going to bed. And like that reflecting on the day or feeling anticipatory for the future. Um, yeah, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not sure why that came up, but I guess it's something for me to reflect on. So I guess uh, maybe having for myself activity that would calm and ease my brain before bed would be really great because I find, I'm a night owl, but unintentionally I have a lot of thoughts
Yeah.
going through my brain.
Yeah, I think that when we feel anxiety when we're going to bed, it's generally an indication that we don't have anything coming up that we are looking forward to. And that needs to be a big wake up call. I think that we often put ourselves in this predicament where it's like, if I just finish X, Y, and Z, then I will feel better. But it's almost like this never ending trajectory where it's like walking through a dark tunnel and you see a light at the end, but we always add more to our dark tunnel. So that light just keeps moving a few steps further away. It's never really attainable. We have to make the choice for the light to come to us. We can't just expect that one day we're going to wake up with no commitments. And that is often where our anxiety comes from, is we have been working so much for that quote unquote light at the end of the tunnel, and we're starting to realize that it's just too far away. And so we just aren't looking forward to anything. And we feel anxious about how much work we have until we reach that light again. Yes, there are certain circumstances where things are difficult and you kind of have to push through. We could say this is common with like students. It's like, I just got to get through the semester. And then once the semester is over, I'll get a breather. For myself, I relate to anyone that's planning a wedding. It's like, let's just get through to the wedding and then I'll get a breather. Certain life events that you can't just pretend aren't happening with a timeline, but ultimately, if there is no reason that you're pushing through for a quote unquote end date, you have to create that end date so that you don't feel like you're just endlessly working without knowing when it's going to be, paying off or give you a reprieve.
Yeah, I agree on that. And as a prior student, I just finished and graduated, and I'm now a recreational
Congratulations.
therapist, which is really awesome. And I think, I I think it's really important to give ourselves like that congratulations, because I think sometimes once we hit that achievement, it's like, okay, the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and just like
Mhm.
that, building onto the light at the end of the tunnel. So really like taking that time to be excited. Um, yeah, I think those are really important things to, have those
Yeah.
moments for sure.
And again, it goes back to the societal expectation that we should always be working on the betterment of ourselves, or like you are failing if you're not always working to achieve something new. And we always just forget to like just take a second and reflect on how far we've come. I think it's more healthy to look at life as increments and be like, I'm going to do some sort of activity to make myself feel like more accomplished, or take on a new skill, but then I'm going to stop and pause and enjoy that before I decide where I'm headed next. And sometimes, and I'm seeing this a lot with my clients, is we don't know when it's okay to stop. And so, I'm overworked, I'm tired, I'm working on this promotion, I'm working on that promotion. Well, do you actually want that promotion? Well, not really. Well, then why are you doing it? And we forget that it's okay to get to a point in your life where you're just content. We are so afraid of contentment because we always think that we could be better. But if we all just paused to evaluate where we're at when we accomplish something new, we might be more apt to recognize, like, I actually think I'm okay with where I'm at now, and I don't need to keep pushing. I'm just going to enjoy this phase of my life. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I'd say it's harder to learn to do that than it is to always be asking yourself what's next.
Yeah. Oof, you just like hit a heartstone for me. Which is awesome because it's great to reflect on. I feel like I'm definitely someone who's always like striving to be better, striving for growth. Like I like wear it as like a badge of honor. But yeah, that like contentment, like I feel like sometimes and like a lot of the time for myself and for lots of individuals, just like not taking that breather and being like, wow, I'm like really content at where I am in life.
Mhm.
And like look at all of the things that I did achieve. I know, I was cleaning out my office today and I always write out my goals and I had it listed on my wall. And I was like, wow, I'm so excited. I actually achieved these goals so I can like recycle this. Um, and so to know, that I like came out of depression and I'm feeling a lot better now is like such a huge honor, but just taking that time to like pause and like be proud of that for sure and content.
100%. And I think, this is a very common thing for people that struggle with anxiety and depression. I am one of these people. So I think, again, like, I feel this. And this is where, you know, my passion for teaching people this comes from, is oftentimes when you struggle with anxiety and depression, one or the other, you hit a low when you feel like there's something else that you should be doing while you're struggling through it. Your depression might alleviate because you know you're working towards something, but your anxiety skyrockets because it's exhausting. We achieve it. We feel pride for a short amount of time. And we are like, wow, I can't believe I was so anxious and depressed. I'll never feel like that again. I've taught myself out of it. But then we repeat the cycle by putting ourselves back into a place of doubting how much we've accomplished. And then that depression leads us to take something else on, and then taking that on, the anxiety kicks back in, and we just think it's normal to ride this wave. And ultimately, it's not normal. It's not healthy. We're like constantly putting ourselves in a state of crisis because we feel like if we're not in a state of crisis, then we are stagnant. But what is wrong with stagnancy? Like, when did we decide that being stagnant in life is a bad thing? How often do we talk to people and say, like, so what have you been up to? And they just say, I'm just working and I'm enjoying my downtime and I'm just living my life. Often when we hear that, we're like, oh, okay. We're used to hearing, oh, I'm studying this, I'm doing that, I'm taking this on, I'm trying to get this job, whatever. And that's when we reward people. That's when we give them, kudos. And for people that often are, we could call them overachievers, perfectionists, people that want to be the best of the best, what we're chasing is a validation that ultimately no one can give us except ourselves. But we think, if I get my degree, I'm going to feel great. You finish your degree and you're like, but I should probably go get my master's. So you go get your master's. You finish your master's and you're like, I should probably get a PhD because there's some people out there that have a PhD and I don't feel satisfied. And then you start asking yourself, am I seriously going back to school for 7 years to see if it gives me this feeling that I'm chasing? But it won't, because what you're chasing is you accepting yourself for where you're at and saying, what life do I want to live? Do I always want to be working? Do I always want to be studying? Am I content finding a decent paying job with manageable work hours so that I can do things that just make me happy? And we never pause to just ask these questions and make an informed decision because we think life's just going to slap us with a bill of satisfaction that is never going to appear. We have to find that ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, that's so huge, and I think we can think about this in love too, of how like you can't find love for yourself from someone else, like you have to
No.
find it yourself. Same with validation. I think these things are very huge and very good reflective pieces for myself included. Um, I think a lot of things are coming up for me, which is really awesome because again, allows me to reflect. But um, I think moving forward in this conversation, we can really take this on and, you know, I think participating in recreation and leisure is really huge. And I always like, as soon as I learned about recreation therapy, I was like, practice what you preach. You have to like do recreation therapy. But there's also barriers. And for myself, included, anxiety and depression have been a huge barrier that have prevented me from doing those activities. How can we find ways to prevent these from being barriers or overcoming these barriers of anxiety and depression when trying to do an activity that is meaningful for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're definitely not alone in this. Again, I struggle with this. And it's funny, like you take something on and you're like, practice what you preach. And I know what I'm talking about like the back of my hand, but Lord knows I don't do it perfectly.
Yeah.
Like I also struggle with it. I also hit periods of depression and anxiety where I have zero motivation to do anything. And so when you hit that low of not having motivation, we do the things we have to do and not the things we want to, because we think eliminating the things we want to is what's going to ultimately make us feel better. But then what we're doing is only doing things that exhaust us. And so often what I think is it's kind of like looking at a mountain. And when you are, in the thick of depression or anxiety, everything that you should be doing doesn't disappear. You still know you should be doing these things, but they feel daunting. And we have a habit of looking at the entire picture of everything we want to be doing and going, well, I can't do it all. And so we do none. And so I think it's about reflecting on what in your docket of things refills your cup are you most likely to do or you find the easiest to do, and you start there. And so, let's say that I feel better when my house is clean and I have a direct indication that I'm losing balance when my house starts to look like a bomb went off. And then what happens is I look at my house and I go, this house is a disaster. I have no time to clean an entire house. So I just keep looking at my house. It's a disaster, feeling guilty about it. And then I just go through this cycle every day. A very simple thing that you learn to do is, okay, I'm going to go to my oven. I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes. And I'm just going to clean for 10 minutes. And whatever I accomplished in that 10 minutes, I'm going to be proud of. It's better than when before I set that timer. And if I walk away from that task without completing everything, I am still going to give myself a pat on the back for doing as much as I did. Carry this forward into recreation and leisure. So, okay, maybe I have this goal that I'm going to walk every day for an hour and I'm going to work my way to running. And then from there, I want to run a marathon. Okay, great goal, go for it if that fills your cup. But walking for an hour might seem excessive and unattainable when you're in this feeling of anxiety and depression. So instead, just say, I'm going to take my morning coffee, and instead of sitting at my kitchen table, I'm going to sit on my front porch and just feel the sun on my face. And then once you get outside and feel the sun on your face, something inside of you is going to say, I could put on my shoes and walk down the block. And then once you walk down the block, something inside of you is going to say, I could take this a few steps further. That is our natural instinct. But trying to force yourself to go from 0 to 100 is never going to help you. Just telling yourself, I'm going to be satisfied with just taking that first step will lead you in the right direction, and it won't feel so overwhelming. So I am, it goes back to that internal dialogue, listening to yourself and saying to yourself, this task I know would be good for me, but that feels overwhelming. So how do I pick another task that doesn't feel so daunting that I feel like I can actually do, and then reward myself without feeling guilty that it wasn't the large, daunting task that I wanted to do in the first place? Work your way up.
Yes, yeah, it's so good to find bite-sized goals that are able to work through and work up to that larger goal, but you know, taking recognition that it's okay to have smaller goals too. And I think, instead of having, a downward spiral of depression by doing one of these activities, then you're more motivated to do it a bit more, and then it's more of an upward spiral of emotions that come along with this. And this is something that I did when I was, in the thick of it this past winter.
Yeah.
Um, and so it was really great to, look at my goals today and say, wow, I've accomplished these and then some, and feel really inspired by that. And now in this conversation, really taking the time to give myself that pat on the back of, wow, I've come out a lot different person than I expected from schooling, and feel ready to take on the profession. And I'm also really grateful that I have, this time right now just to soak up the sun and enjoy the weather before I know life does get a little bit more hectic. So I'm trying to put those recreation and leisure things into my calendar so that I'm filling up my bucket.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's just about recognizing when, the little bird on your shoulder is telling you that you're incapable of doing something. And then what do you have to do to just flip that switch? And that simple one step task, the easiest thing, is all it is doing is showing you that you are capable of making changes in a manageable and sustainable pattern. And these words come up repetitively throughout this conversation because it's about recognizing that you don't have to be perfect. Nobody is. Every step in life, we're going to ebb and flow. As much as we try to find something that's maintainable, we're going to hit a wall. And it's okay to give yourself forgiveness for feeling like you've hit a wall or feeling like you're in a low. I'm not asking everyone to have a perfect day every day. It's about saying to yourself, I recognize I'm not feeling like my best self. So, how do I take my goals and just make them maintainable again so that I can work my way back up to when I was feeling my best? And as long as you always recognize that you have a choice and you're capable of getting back there, it's okay to feel low sometimes. We often make it worse when we feel guilty for not being in our best headspace. And no one is always in their best headspace. So just accept it for what it is, be kind to yourself, and set yourself up for feeling like you did the best you could, whether you're at your highest or your lowest.
Yeah, that's really great advice. And I think something else that I think is important to touch on is I'll I like throwing myself under the bus or giving my own examples so that people can, relate or not feel like they're alone. But for myself, sometimes new tasks feel very anxious and anxiety inducing. And
Mhm.
one of my clients, funny, I'm supposed to give my clients advice or support them, and they're giving me advice, but that's fine. I think we all have something, to learn from each and every individual. And
100%.
this individual gave me the beautiful advice, actually gave themselves the beautiful advice, and I kind of took it along as my nugget too,
Yeah.
of think best case scenario. So when I'm learning a new task, this is something that used to be very anxiety provoking for me. When I was doing a new leisure activity, because I'm in the field of recreation therapy. I know why I set the standard, but sometimes I'm like, I don't care if I'm a beginner, I need to be a professional right now. And
Mhm.
that's just not going to happen. So
Mhm.
just being okay with being a beginner. And I
Yeah.
think, for myself, I'm taking like a wellness peer led course. And I think it's really great just being, a peer and being a part of it and not having to lead it, not having that responsibility, and just going with it and allowing myself to be a beginner. And yeah, I think it's been really huge for me to take that leap.
Totally. And you know what you're experiencing, it's something that we call in therapy, it's called imposter syndrome. And it's this belief that if you're not the best of the best, then you're not qualified to be doing what you're doing. And it's about accepting that everyone was a beginner at some point. There's no such thing as going from learning to expert. And it's just a natural instinct that happens when we doubt ourselves and we feel like if we are not at our best all of the time, then someone's going to recognize that. We're going to get called out. We'll be perceived as unworthy. And reality is that no one's watching you except yourself. So that's a pressure you're putting on yourself. That doesn't make it easier to recognize that, but it's important to see that, if you weren't your best self, no one would know any different. What you're describing as the advice that you were given of look at best case scenario. So in one of the methods of therapy I use, it's called cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. And there's a very common understanding, or I guess you could say the root of CBT is an understanding that just because you think something doesn't mean it's true. And when we're looking at thoughts, and let's say looking at new tasks, we tend to put a generalization of what we expect is going to happen, which is often where that anticipatory anxiety comes from.
Yep.
And so, there's a whole list of questions you can ask yourself, but the big ones that I recommend are asking, what is the best case scenario? What is the worst case scenario? And what's the realistic scenario? And when you set it up to actually separate those three, you start to recognize that worst case scenario is not realistic. And it's okay to see that best case scenario is not realistic either, so that you're not putting, pressure on yourself to be perfect, but you're also not expecting the worst of yourself either. And that's how we can start to look at situations from like a perspective of ability versus a perspective of I'm setting myself up for failure.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that and really breaking it down. I know I've talked about this previously, but I definitely had imposter syndrome when I first started the podcast. And um, as I started it, I ended up taking like almost a year break because I was like, I don't know if I could do this. Like, I'm not qualified. And I'm like, it's a podcast. I don't have to be
Podcast.
qualified. But also, I think it's really important to be open and honest with my own experiences, and then also to share and learn from others, because I think, having you here today, I've learned a lot about myself. And then also, we've learned a lot about, the beautiful things that social work and recreation therapy have to overlap, which is great.
Totally. I mean, everything goes hand in hand. And I think some people naturally relate more to like recreation. Some people naturally, do better when discussing mental health. Oftentimes the two go directly hand in hand. You can't really have one without the other, but it's about recognizing like where you find, that spark of inspiration. And again, it's different for everyone, but when we work as a team, you at least fill those gaps. You have a skill set that I don't have and vice versa. And so when we work together, we offer people, the best possible outcome because we're meeting people's needs no matter how different they are.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's so important is, you know, for ourselves, for clients, we can always think of, meeting them where they're at, and just accepting that with unconditional support. And for ourselves, unconditional love. I think that's so huge for sure.
100% I agree.
Yeah. So in the next question I prepped, we've kind of already discussed this, which is awesome because we have really naturally led lots of this conversation. But I did do a deep dive on your website and Instagram, and it's amazing, by the way, both of
Oh,
them.
thank you.
You're welcome. And I saw that really self care is really important to you, and you really advocate for this. And I'm wondering if you break down self care in any different forms or ways.
Absolutely. So I think the reason that I think self-care is so important, or the reason that I don't even say I think, I know it's so important, is because sometimes when we don't put ourselves first in any aspect of our life, we kind of wander around like zombies where you're just doing tasks and you're not really evaluating them or like paying attention to how you're feeling about them. And that's often where we hit rock bottom or like straight out burnout because we've never taken a second to look around and ask how we're feeling. Self-care is like a repetitive thing that you do to take a step back, make yourself feel better, but also evaluate just how you're feeling in general. So I've had episodes of self-care where I'm like, oh my gosh, I am in a bad place right now. Like, good thing I booked this. I've had periods of self-care. I'm like, I feel like all I've been doing is self-care. Like, I'm living my best life. You don't have to be at rock bottom to get something from it. Usually, I'm more proud of myself when I'm like, man, I feel great. I feel like I've done nothing but self-care. Awesome. Hit both. They're both important. I see it in my life in a few different ways. So I am a very social person, but like I said previously, I work in a very social environment. So I need to find a balance between spending time with like my partner, my parents, my in-laws, and my friends, and also spending time by myself. And I have learned how to schedule my life so that I get a good balance of both. Um, I tell everyone that this is going to look a little bit different. For myself, my partner works, part time away from home, part time at home. So obviously, when he's away from home, I'm more likely to book my alone time self care versus when he's home, I tend to book my self care where we see family or do things together. I'm very lucky that I have a structure in my life that allows for that. Sometimes my self-care, like I said, is just sitting on the couch, eating popcorn, watching Netflix. Sometimes it's as intentional as like putting on a face mask, running a bath, buying myself a very fancy bath bomb, and like being like, this is my self-care treat. Skip the dishes is also like, I don't have to cook. What an amazing way to do self-care. Like these simple things that Sometimes, and this is a big one I tell people, sometimes we do self-care, but we don't intentionally see it as self-care. And sometimes just flipping the script to say, I am doing this to make myself feel good makes tenfold difference. So skip the dishes is a perfect example. People often will say, I don't feel like cooking dinner, so I'm going to order something. And then we feel guilty later because we shouldn't have spent the money, or, I should have made something healthier or whatever. But if you flip the script to say, I was burnt out, and so I made the choice to treat myself to a meal being delivered to my house. That was my self care. You will feel pride, not guilt. And again, a balance. We don't want to always be doing this, but recognition for what you're doing is important. Now, I think that everyone already has some element of self care. I don't think that there's a single person that would survive without doing something for themselves, but you have to look at it and ask, am I doing enough of it? Or is there something else that I could be integrating that would make me, feel more fulfilled or more at peace? And I think that that is honestly, I think one of the biggest things in therapy is just recognizing, like, what am I doing for me? And this looks different for everyone, but sometimes even just booking a therapy session, just literally booking it, is your self-care. That's great, but yeah, just paying attention to yourself. It goes back to paying attention to yourself. And I pay attention to myself. I recognize that these things are so much easier said than done, but it's just like any habit. The more you do it, the more, natural it becomes. Then you're not really thinking about it anymore. It's just a part of your lifestyle.
Yes, yes, for sure. And I think, like you mentioned, of that like intentionality, skip the dishes and flipping a script and having that intentionality of, oh, I don't want to clean today. I don't want to cook today. You know what? I'm going to do some self care and I'm going to get takeout. Um,
Totally.
I think that's so important. And I think I want to touch just briefly on the hard self care because my sister-in-law is a psychologist and she always hits me with the truth bombs of those like hard self-care is like setting boundaries and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about those hard self-care things that don't typically get put under this like beautiful, like Instagram worthy self-careness, but are very hard self-care
Oh
things.
yeah. Boundaries is like the word of this decade, I swear. Like it's everything. I would actually say exactly like you said, I bet you that if we really dug deep into what self-care is, it's about setting boundaries. That's exactly what it is. Now, setting boundaries is both external and internal. So, externally, we need to set boundaries with the way that we allow people to have expectations of us, whether that's professional or personal. We are the people that control what other people expect us to do on a day to day basis. So if we are a hard worker and we feel like we're going to be a bad worker if we never say no and we always say yes, the people we work for are always going to expect us to say yes and automatically put more on our plates. So when we start to feel burnt out and we feel this need for self care, oftentimes it's rooted in getting comfortable with just saying no and recognizing that that doesn't make you a bad employee or a lazy person, but you're setting a boundary so that you can be a good worker for a longer amount of time. And recognizing that that's more important as an employee than it is to be the perfect employee. This goes in personal relationships. So maybe your parents expect you to go for dinner every Sunday, and you're starting to feel like that is a sixth day of work. And it's awkward to learn to say, I can only come for Sunday dinner twice a month. But setting that boundary is self care. When I talk about the internal part of setting boundaries, it's because these things are going to not feel natural and they're going to make you feel a sense of selfishness or guilt. And just like any habit, like I was just saying, it will get easier in time, but learning to set those boundaries is so important. Now, my own therapist gave me the best analogy, and I share this with literally everyone. Setting boundaries with people in your life is like setting boundaries with children at a grocery store, where if you're at a grocery store and you were taking care of a child and you're paying and the child hands you a chocolate bar and says, I want this chocolate bar, and you say no and they start kicking and screaming, are you going to buy the chocolate bar, or are you going to teach a life lesson so that in the future they recognize they can't always have what they want by kicking and screaming? seems really easy when we talk about that example. But when we look at being an adult, you know, kicking and screaming in adults looks a lot like guilt tripping. And, oh, but if you don't do this, then I can't have that. Or, well, that makes me feel like you're being a little bit selfish or whatever. If you can start to recognize that these types of one-liners are actually temper tantrums, you're more likely to set a boundary to teach a life lesson. The life lesson you're teaching is that you have self-worth and that you're not going to put yourself in a predicament where you lose intention and balance. And the more that you prevent temper tantrums, the less likely they are to happen in the future. And so it feels really bad at the beginning. I always tell people learning to set boundaries in your life is by a long shot the hardest thing you'll ever do, but you will never thank yourself more than when it starts to pay off and you don't feel the pressures of life getting thrown at you constantly. And so yeah, if we all learned to set boundaries and be honest with ourselves, we wouldn't feel like we're hitting self-care as a crisis point, but more so as an intentional choice that we just schedule day to day.
Yeah, for sure. You can think of it like exercise or eating healthy. It's a preventative measure, not just something that we do when we are at that low. I think, how you mentioned self care and self worth and setting those boundaries is so, so huge for sure.
Yeah.
And, really owning up and recognizing our self worth is really huge and a really hard and challenging subject in amongst itself for sure.
100%. I think one of the best questions to ask yourself is if you were talking to someone in your exact same predicament, feeling the exact same things, what advice would you give them? And if you aren't taking that advice back, that should be an eye opener for you.
Yeah, I think self compassion is so huge there for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah. This has been such an amazing conversation. I feel so inspired and reflective in amongst myself, and I'm wondering if you have any recommendations you'd like to share with anyone before we close up this conversation.
I think to close it all up, the biggest thing I would say is that you just have to be honest with yourself. It's okay to be selfish. Being selfish is perceived as a bad thing when in actuality, it's absolutely necessary. And if you feel like there's some sort of truth that is preventing you from feeling like life is going the way you need it to, that you don't feel happy, fulfilled, rested, inspired, it's okay to say something needs to change and not feel guilty about that. Life's too short to think that you should always be running at empty. You have a choice, no matter how far fetched it feels. When you start taking steps towards it, it will be far more attainable than you can even imagine. So just trust your gut, listen to yourself, invest time, thought, and effort into yourself, and the payoff will affect so many more aspects of your life than you could actually imagine.
It's really awesome. And do you have any recommendations for like books or anything to, continue the thought of self care and just taking time for ourselves moving forward?
Yeah, my biggest person, and I'm sure that you hear this all the time, is Brene Brown. I don't know if Brene Brown's ever come up, but like Brene Brown is just has this amazing way of speaking about vulnerability and authenticity. And oftentimes we think about vulnerability and authenticity being about the way that we talk to other people, but it's about the way we talk to ourselves too. And it's about admitting that I don't have to be perfect, but I have to be honest about what my needs are. And so I would say, even like her TED Talks, her videos, if you're not a reader, but her books are absolutely phenomenal too. And you can find some amazing accounts even on like Instagram. So, going hashtag mental health, hashtag therapists or therapists in my area. If you're someone who's naturally scrolling your phone anyway, trying to change the content you're looking at from being a perspective of like, always work hard, fight for your dreams, be the best version of yourself, to like be gentle with yourself, be authentic to your needs. Just absorbing that type of information on a platform you're likely going to look at anyway will help you to not feel like you are chasing a lifestyle that's not attainable either.
Yeah, I agree. And that's definitely like a gradual change that I made. I noticed that I was taking more time on my phone, which happens during COVID, I guess, and it's
Definitely.
slowly unhappening, but still in the works. But that's something that I did too of unfollow the things that, don't feel or speak to me and make me feel shame. If I am scrolling and something makes me feel shameful, I unfollow that account, unfortunately. and just like really tailoring that. And I think Brene Brown also has a really great podcast, which is
Oh
awesome.
yeah.
That if you're more of an audio person, I recommend that too for sure.
Yeah, she's like the absolute angel of social work. Like we all want to be Brene Brown. She's awesome. So I cannot recommend. You cannot go wrong with any sort of Brene Brown content.
I agree for sure. So is there any way we can connect with you, or anyone can connect with you if they wanted to chat with you or get a hold of you afterwards?
Absolutely. So you can either go to my website, which is kindredroots.ca, or you can follow me on Instagram at Kindred Roots Counselling. I'm more than happy to chat if you send me a private message on Instagram if you're kind of asking questions. It doesn't have to be to access therapy. I'm always happy to just be here. And if you ever are just looking for information that would be pertinent to your own situation, if I'm not the right person, I will always be happy to point you in the right direction.
Yeah, that's very awesome. And, to wrap up, is there any closing thoughts that you'd love to share with anyone before we head out here?
No, I think just like thank you for having me. And at the end of the day, it just goes back to like remember your self worth and remember that it's okay to ask for your needs. And that's just the final thought of the day.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. It was so great chatting with you, and it's truly inspired me and allowed me to reflect. And that's probably what I'm going to do this afternoon. So thank you.
I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.